Good afternoon, everyone, and warmly welcome to this webinar, which we have called Happiness and Productivity. What do we know and what can we do? We have two very prominent guests with us today, and they are Mr. Andrew Oswald and Petri Böckerman. Andrew Oswald is a professor of economics and behavioral science at the University of Warwick, and he's specialized in empirical studies of job satisfaction, mental health, and productivity. And in the beginning of June, he will be the keynote speaker in a large global conference on well-being. Mr. Böckerman is a professor of health economics at University and a researcher at Labour Institute of Economic Research in Finland, a trade union-related institute. Böckerman is also a fellow at the world-renowned ISA Institute on Labor Economics in Germany. The organizer of this webinar is the Productivity Commission, which is a new 3-year initiative by the unions within Swedish industry, facken inom industrin, in cooperation with the Arena-gruppen. And my name is Daniel Lind, and I'm running this project on a daily basis. And my background is I've been a policy director and chief economist within the trade union movement in Sweden for 15 years. And with this webinar, we start a longer-term work on work environment issues and its relations to efficiency of organizations. So with an interdisciplinary approach, our second step will be a research overview with two psychologists after the summer. But for now, the setup of today's webinar is very straightforward with two presentations by Oswald and Mr. Böckerman, and then a rather longest discussion after that. So please state your short and sharp questions on the website during the presentations, and we will address them afterwards. So having said that, Mr. Oswald, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much for the kind invitation. I'm going to talk about what I might call the economics and psychology of job satisfaction and happiness at work. And I'll just see if I can get these slides to begin to show. Do tell me, Daniel, if you can see them. I'm hoping you can see them now. Daniel, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can do. We can see it. Perfect.
You can see the slides, yes.
Yeah, perfect.
Very good indeed. So let's start with a simple fact that human beings have feelings, ladies and gentlemen, as I'm sure you know very well, even though if you do a PhD in economics, you don't hear very much about the role of feelings. Anger, you'll have encountered it yourself. Boredom, I hope not from this lecture too much. Sadness, and of course, most important of all, happiness. And I'm hoping that you recognize our respective prime ministers. This was taken a few days ago. And your prime minister, I think, is a brave person. You can see that she has good sense because she's out in a boat with Boris Johnson, and she's been sensible enough to put a life jacket on in a boat. And I must say, a lot of us who live in this country feel sometimes we could do with a life jacket from Mr. Johnson. Humans have feelings, and feelings matter a lot. I'll be interested especially in how satisfied different kinds of human beings are with their jobs, and more broadly, what are the characteristics of what we might call happy workplaces and fulfilling kinds of work. There are two ways that researchers like Petri and like me have employed to try to understand this. The first method is the simplest of all, and that is you take large random samples of people and you ask them what it is that they would like in a job. It's often sensible to do that in a fairly unstructured way so that you listen to people rather than forcing them to say different kinds of things. And different kinds of individuals, of course, want different characteristics from their work. Method two is more statistical. I'm going to take you through, if I may, evidence from both. Method two is more like the techniques used in epidemiology, that part of medical science. You've probably heard the advice that it's a good idea to eat a wide spread of fruits and vegetables to reduce your risk of cancer, and that it's not a good idea to smoke because it will give you heart disease and so on. And that kind of conclusion comes from the same statistical methods that we use to try to understand what it is that determines who is satisfied and what kinds of workplaces produce happy workers. There's also a literature on what happiness at work does. In other words, not looking at what it is that determines work happiness, but rather what in turn might ensue after work. I'll go through some of those results also fairly quickly. We'd like to know whether the following kind of statement, which is from Google, is true, or is it just a lot of hype? Google early on famously publicized the idea that they wanted their workplaces to be fun to go on. And indeed, if you go into establishments run by Google all over the world, you find internal bicycles and places to play and all sorts of stuff. At Google, we've noticed employees who are happy are more motivated. But is that really true? From the point of view of a researcher, we'd like to know whether that's just a lot of puffery, a lot of publicity. Let me start with the basics then. What do employees say that they want if they're part of our large random sample surveys and they're asked? Here I take international data from something called the ISSP data set from covering many countries. And if you go through the answers, they don't come out exactly as I would have predicted, but perhaps you have better intuition. Here are the top two things that people say in random sample surveys when they're asked what they want in a job. They say job security and work that is interesting. Those are the two things that human beings say when asked in a fairly unprompted, unstructured way. The next four priorities are these, ladies and gentlemen, in order. A job that allows me to work independently. In other words, humans like autonomy. They don't like to be told every detail of what they should do. I have been in economics and psychology kinds of research since I was about 17 and a half years old, I suppose. And I've really liked that. I've stayed with it. I've been offered some jobs at banks and consultancies, but I suppose one of the main reasons why I stayed a kind of professor person is that personally, Andrew values a lot of independence. I do have a boss, I suppose my head of department, and ultimately a president of my university, but neither of those people knows that I'm talking to you today, and I didn't have to ask their permission. I rather like that kind of job. People also want opportunities for advancement. In plain English, of course, they want to know how they can get promoted. A further factor that is actually, I think, very important. People in large numbers will say, I want a job that is useful for society. A very interesting researcher called Durr, Robert Durr, who works in the Netherlands, if I remember, has shown that nearly 1 in 10 workers in Europe say, I believe my job is socially useless, about 1 in 10 workers. And also the final priority out of 6 is high income. For economists, or if you've done a PhD or master's in economics, you might think that money would be higher up. We tend to get our students to obsess about money, but of course it's on the list, but it's a long way from top. Now, what about the statistical literature? Here we don't ask people what it is that they think makes them happy at work. We don't do that. Just like doctors, epidemiologists, they don't ask, do you think it's a good idea to eat a lot of apples and oranges? Instead, we measure how satisfied people are with their job. Then we ask a lot of other questions about their life. Are they married? What's their commuting time? How senior are they? What do they get paid? And we, the statistical researchers, can look into, thanks to the computer, and look in and see the underlying patterns. It might be quite hard for the individual to know those patterns, even though we'll see that method 1 and method 2 do come out with fairly similar kinds of insights. A standard sort of question is like this. I'll say 7 if I'm completely satisfied with my job and 1 if I'm completely dissatisfied. And here's some good news, because in Europe, we actually find high levels of job satisfaction, about 5.5, very roughly out of 7, say, roughly. That's important because I had to read Karl Marx as a young man, and lots about worker alienation and the suppression of humans by bosses and so on. But in fact, if you look at the data, Europeans anyway rather like their jobs, and that seems important to know, although of course different Europeans have different levels of job satisfaction, as we'll see. Could you guess, I know you can't answer me here, but could you guess the most satisfied and least satisfied countries in Europe? If your geography is good, you might guess at that. In fact, Switzerland is top, and at least on the recent data I saw, Czech Republic is low. I suppose the key point I'd be pleased if people saw here, though, is that the spread of numbers are always pretty high. Remember, 7 is the maximum. 7 is people saying, I'm perfectly satisfied. What about the second method? Now this looks more complicated. These are equations. If you like equations, you should just think of this as y equals a function of x, y equals f of x, where x is a whole bunch of things that determine y. If you don't like mathematics, then that's fine. Just think of this as a kind of giant recipe for making something like spaghetti bolognese. We're making spaghetti bolognese, and it depends on the tomatoes and the herbs and the garlic and the lamb and everything else. And we'd like to know, using our regression equation, how important is the lamb, what's the relative weight on the tomato and so on, in producing a good tasting, that's the way to think about it, a good tasting spaghetti bolognese. We're doing that with a computer to determine the patterns of the relative importance of things that affect human job satisfaction. You can think of this as fitting lines through lots of dots on a piece of graph paper, where the individual dots are humans, and technically speaking, the computer is fitting the line through many dimensions. So we'd like to know, what does age do to job satisfaction? What does gender do? What does pay do? What does the education level do? And so on. I won't present any equations. I'm just going to tell you what they show. So here are some of the key determinants of job satisfaction, especially in industrialized countries. Here they are. Pay comes in positive, as you might imagine. Perhaps the coefficient is not as large as you might think, but it comes in positive. Workplaces are a strong negative. Human beings like to work in small groups, and the bigger your workplace, the less cheerful, on average, people feel. They have lower job satisfaction, and they have to be rewarded with higher pay in general. Labour economists have known for a long time that big workplaces pay more. And I think that's because a small work team is intrinsically attractive. In a giant workplace, you don't know most people. It feels impersonal. It may feel overwhelming, and so on. Women report slightly higher job satisfaction in industrialized countries compared to men. We don't know why that is. There's a big disputatious, quite fierce literature arguing on different sides. My own view is that it's probably because, as there is still some female discrimination, women, for any given kind of job package, feel luckier, you might say, because they know it's harder for women to get equality. That's my take on it, though nobody knows for sure why women report higher job satisfaction scores. Job security comes in strongly positive, rather like the method 1 result, just asking people. Perhaps surprisingly, education doesn't have much effect. You can find studies, as Petri may say, showing that education is positive on job satisfaction. And you can find studies showing that education is negative. But overall, I'd say that the finding is a 0. And partly, some of my work has suggested, and others have suggested, that there's a sort of sting in the tail to being highly educated. And that is that you expect more. So if I'm earning 100,000 euros a year in a job where I have a nice work surroundings and I have low education, I tend to feel extremely satisfied. Whereas if I am very highly qualified, earning 100,000 euros a year, I may not feel so pleased compared to somebody with few qualifications. That's one theory. And finally, autonomy, independence is another big positive. Here's a fact worth knowing. The single strongest predictor of a person's job satisfaction is the following. Here it is, ladies and gentlemen. The competence of their boss. It's taken the research literature a long time to get onto this, even though if you talk to real people, talk to your friends about their workplaces, they will often talk about the boss. And bosses are not always good news. If anybody on this call would like the reference, I tend to be a big supporter of work that I've had a hand in. I'm sorry if that's not what one wants to hear, but it is rather human. And I have a hand in this paper by Arts and others. Who's the perfect boss? Well, my wife thinks this is the perfect boss here, but I suspect it has more to do with his good looks than anything else. On the issue of pay, there's a lot of research that shows that it's relative pay, particularly where people lie in a kind of hierarchy, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Am I the 5th best paid professor at Warwick? Am I the 105th best paid professor, and so on? The data suggests that if you want to know whether Mr. Oswald is satisfied, especially with his pay, don't ask him what he earns. Ask him where does he think he stands in the hierarchy of pay compared to all the other professors on the corridor in his economics department. Humans seem to have to look over their shoulder before they can decide how happy they feel. I think all HR managers know this, but it's an important fact always to bear in mind. It's a lot less about absolute pay. It's tremendously about relative pay. On autonomy, on independence, if you're in charge of a workplace and you're listening to this, who controls the pace of work in our research seems to be very important. We find that workers are okay if it's the customers who control how fast their work comes to them, the workers. They're okay if their colleagues do as well. They don't like it when machines or distant bosses decide how hard the individual workers have to work. So who controls the pace of work? That's very important in the design of a happy workplace. And I'm not sure everybody is aware of that. Do give small freedoms to your employees. This is a backup of the autonomy point. In some of our international survey work, we find that if people say they can move their desk very slightly, then they tend to be happier in the workplace. Small freedoms are cheap to give, and in our work, we find they're associated with high job satisfaction. There's also a very important life cycle pattern for us all to understand, not just as workers, but as humans, because there really is a midlife crisis. If you look at Swedish data on suicide and the taking of antidepressants, you'll see the same. Happiness really is U-shaped through life, and something like that is typically found in job satisfaction data. I've given talks like this to multinational companies, and their HR departments, their human resources departments, know this. I've had senior people come up to me after a talk to a multinational, and they say, you know, you spoke about the midlife crisis. We've often wondered why in our worker engagement surveys in our job satisfaction surveys in our companies, it's the middle-aged people who seem to be complaining. Some work has also shown that chimpanzees and orangutans seem to be less happy in midlife as well. Should organizations want their workers to have high job satisfaction? And the answer very probably is yes. I think high mental well-being for workers might be taken as valuable in itself, something we care about in a society. But there's also work, partly by Petri, who will speak in a minute, I think, which suggests that there's a kind of causal influence. If you can make workers happier, then you will make them more productive. We're still learning about exactly how that operates, and today is not the day to take you through in detail how we do that kind of work. So here I'll go rather quickly, if I may, ladies and gentlemen. Work by Edmonds, who's at the London Business School, finds that companies in the list of so-called 100 best companies to work for in America, if you follow them through time, they have a higher increase in their share price, their stock price. Petri's work in Finnish establishments in Finland, finds something rather similar. If you measure job satisfaction today, then if you go back to the establishment some years later, then you find that their value added, their productivity tends to have improved. And finally, I think at Warwick University, we've done the first large-scale true randomized controlled trial. This was published in one of the economics journals. We studied 500 or 600 people who were all doing in the lab a kind of white-collar task under timed pressure. We made them, half of them happy in controlled conditions compared to others, to a baseline group. And I won't go into the details today, but making them happy produced about a 12% rise in their productivity. Now, that was not what you'd call a real work setting, but it does complement, I think, encouragingly, the work from real settings. And it has the advantage, ladies and gentlemen, of having been a proper randomized controlled trial. We think somehow the people in our trial had more energy. We don't know why. I'm going to say a few more things and then draw to a halt, because I'd like plenty of time for questions, if I may. Quits are also very expensive. So a simple reason why you would want happy workers if you're running a company, if you can have happy workers, is you don't want to be refilling jobs all the time. It's expensive to advertise, interview, and so on. Just before I close, this is also, I think, worth noting by academics and by trade unions and by companies that we're learning scientifically that there are complicated interactions between the mind and the body. It's almost as though if I have a happy mind, if that doesn't sound too strange, then my body will be healthier. And you may see here, ladies and gentlemen, that I've clipped in an old photograph of myself from my youth here. I hope you can see me there in my youth. Some of this has been shown by a man called Cohen in the United States. He's shown that less stressed people have stronger immune systems. He squirts a virus up the nose in people's nose in the lab and shows that happy people can ward off the symptoms better. There's work in this kind of complicated journal where a team at King's College London takes puncture wounds makes puncture wounds, takes skin out of people, then measures how quickly the wounds heal. I don't know what they have to pay people to do this, but they take a chunk of skin, they measure how quickly the wounds heal, and they find that happier humans heal up more quickly on these standardized puncture tests, you might call them. So we need to understand these mind-body interconnections better. And I would love to do that in my lifetime, but I suspect we won't get to the bottom of it terribly well in the next 20 or 30 years. Let me draw to a close and thank you for tuning in. There are clear patterns in job satisfaction. All research teams around the world, from psychology and economics, behavioral science, epidemiology, and so on, agree, I think, about these basic patterns. We know about the patterns across different sorts of people. and patterns across different nations. Sweden does fairly well on job satisfaction. Second, I do think that job satisfaction is valuable in itself for organizations. Some people complain about that, and as I think I implied, if you've done a PhD in economics, you've been told to look down on anything to do with human feelings or data on job satisfaction and the rest. But that doesn't seem to me to be sensible anymore, though I did a PhD in economics, straight economics, many decades ago. High job satisfaction pays off for organizations. Probably it's also valuable for health. If I'm happy, then it seems that my whole physical strength and ability to ward off attacks on the body somehow, that's better. We don't exactly know how. There is a midlife crisis in human happiness and in job satisfaction. If you are about the age of 45 and you're feeling that life has come to a bit of a low point and that you're wondering, what's the point of it all, then you are completely normal. That is natural. And by your early 50s, on average, you'll be starting to feel better. Life will be in perspective. I went through this myself. I recommend it. And it's very important to know that there really is a suicide peak, very sadly, in industrialized countries for people in their mid-40s and late 40s. So this shows up in your work as at work. Giving people small freedoms is a really good idea. Let them move their desk, let them do lots of things that don't cost you much, but these seem to produce tremendous mental gains. Money does matter, but it's especially relative income, and it only matters a bit. What people say they particularly want, and I think that we're going into a major stagflationary period in Europe. I'm sure that's not news to you, but we're going into what I saw as a young man in the 1970s. It drew me into economics. We're going back into stagflation. People want job security, and of course they want interesting work. I certainly want interesting work, and you probably do too. And finally, the boss has a huge effect on people's well-being. And even if we can't all be as handsome as this gentleman, at least, ladies and gentlemen, we can buy the hat. We can buy the hat. That's my view. Thank you very much for listening.
Many thanks, Mr. Oswald, for this informative presentation. Before I leave the floor to Petri, I just have two short questions. And the first one is concerning job satisfaction over time. Can we see that people are getting more satisfied with work if you were 30 years old 30 years ago compared to a 30-year-old today and a 50-year-old?
Yes, you ask a very good question, Daniel, of course, and a very important one. My broad take on the data is that these numbers are running flat through time. Now, there is some evidence that before the early 2000s, we went through a period in Europe of slight decline through time, slight decline. But I think that that may have been associated with the difficult period in the 70s, 80s, and 90s in the economy. Yeah. And although I'm open to the data, and Petri may know more up-to-date data, my general view is that job satisfaction is running pretty flat for the average person.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. And the second question, I will get back to the boss issue later on, but the short question is, when you talk about job security, do you mean a permanent position, or is that what people mean?
Yes, I suppose I do.
Yeah.
As a literal matter, I mean, humans don't like fear, F-E-A-R. I've been working on well-being data now since the early 1990s. And I've looked across countless data sets and written 100 papers or whatever I've done. And a key principle that I've come to believe in is that everything to do with what you might call background fear, fear at the back of my mind, that's very corrosive. It's very harmful to mental well-being. So my country, like yours, has a kind of national health service for health. And I don't worry about becoming ill. nearly as much as I would in other countries, because I know that I won't have to pay if I'm diagnosed with cancer and so on. That background fear, we know that national health service systems seem to be associated with much higher happiness for people. Fear of unemployment is a huge negative. Fear of war, fear of crime, and so on. So I think the reason that job security matters is that I don't have to worry in the middle of the night when I wake up, might I be out of a job 2 months from now with young children in the house? What would I do? I think this is why job security is crucial.
Okay, thanks. And just a short remark, when we have done these questions on white collar workers in Sweden, and we compare men and women, women always ask higher answers when it comes to every domain of life: family, health, friends, living, housing, but for work. So this really strange pattern that women are really happy about other parts of the life compared to men, but not when it comes to work. So we have a discussion on what is that? What is going on here? Is it stress?
Okay. You'll remember from my presentation, I did not conclude that.
No, exactly.
But perhaps I should explain that what I'm doing in these slides that we've seen is to look at the influence of one factor, holding all the other factors constant.
Yeah.
Now, women do earn less, for example, and that will make them less satisfied. But if we compare a woman with the same job characteristics, the same pay, the same level of seniority, the same kind of house, we compare a woman to a man, then in general, in the data, as Petri would probably say, but he can disagree if he wants, women tend to report slightly higher, but that is ceteris paribus, other things constant.
Oh, okay. We continue the discussion after Petri's presentation. Are you prepared, Petri?
Oh, yeah. So you're most likely seeing my slides now. Are you seeing my slides now?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, thanks. So thanks a lot. So I will present some results using the Finnish linked employee data. So we have actually done quite a lot of research using the Finnish linked data with Pekka Ilmakunnas from the Aalto University over the years. But this presentation is actually only focused this issue on job satisfaction and productivity. And of course, Andrew covered a lot of other issues, very important issues related to job satisfaction and well-being. But actually, my presentation is only focused this very, very narrow, but I think very important issue about job satisfaction and productivity. So basically, I mean, these slides basically contain some technical material also that I will not present, but I will try to focus my presentation only on the most important substantive issues regarding this job satisfaction, performance, or productivity link. And basically, I think that one important gap in the literature is this. I mean, there's a huge literature, for example, in psychology, work psychology, about the link between job satisfaction and job performance at the individual level. But there is, I think, quite important gap regarding the mechanisms. So we don't know why there is correlation between job satisfaction and job performance exactly. And of course, there are many hypotheses in the literature. For example, higher level of job satisfaction will most likely reduce some harmful on the job activities and things like that. So basically, that is one important gap. So as in our paper, we also kind of estimate some type of reduced form model. So we cannot pinpoint using this type of registered linked data using also survey information about the exact mechanism. So that is one gap. So what we do here is that we use this Finnish link data. So we have standard measures of productivity. And I think that this is very important because if you look at the, for example, work psychology literature, they have almost always used the self-reported measures of performance and productivity at the individual level. And I think that it's quite problematic to correlate self-reported measures of performance and productivity at the individual with the self-reported measure of well-being, I mean, job satisfaction. So there could be some personality, for example, have an impact on those self-reported measures of performance and productivity. And of course, it is also a component of job satisfaction, at least potentially. So what we do here is that we use standard measures of productivity, which here means the value added per hours of work at the plant or establishment level as a dependent variables in this analysis. And what we also have is that we use data on nationally representative sample of plants or firms in the private sector. And most of the earlier literature in work psychology have focused only on a narrow and selected set of firms. And I also think that this is quite problematic in a sense that it is quite difficult in some studies to generalize the results to the whole economy. And I think that this Finnish data that contains nationally representative information regarding the private sector is important and in this respect. And that improves the external validity of the findings. So what we try to contribute with our study is that we use the standard measures of productivity and nationally representative data. So we try to also address the issue, I mean, this two-way relationship between firm productivity and job satisfaction, because one quite obvious problem with that type of research is that the good or high productivity, high wage firms usually also invest more to their workers that will improve their job satisfaction levels. So there is potentially this two-way causal relationship between firm productivity and job satisfaction. And we use this linked data that contains information on job satisfaction and also on productivity. And we link these two data sets using plant and firm codes. So the information on job satisfaction comes from this European community household panel. And it contains a standard question on job satisfaction measured on a scale from 1 to 6. And I think that one extremely important point regarding all studies on job satisfaction is that most of the workers actually are highly satisfied with their work. And this is actually shown here. This basically shows only the distribution of job satisfaction, average job satisfaction in our data at the plant level. So in most firms or plants, the average level of job satisfaction is very high when we measured it from the scale to 1 to 6. So the average is almost 5. So these have some important implications regarding how to improve productivity by increasing average level of job satisfaction in firms or plants. And the other data set that we use is this fleet that contains information on productivity. And it basically contains information on value added hours worked, capital stock, and things like that, and some other important control variables, for example, whether the firm's exports or not. So what we do here is that we use the standard measures of productivity, and we have basically 3 measures of productivity. And the best productivity measure is this value added per hours worked, and that is possible to get from the manufacturing sector. And then we also use total factor productivity that takes into account the capital stock. And then we have from non-manufacturing sector, we use this turnover per employee, which is much imprecise productivity measure compared to this value added per hours worked. And these two, the first two measures are available for the manufacturing sector, and turnover per employee is also available for the other private sector firms or plants. So what we do here is that we try to explain the average level of productivity in the establishment, and we explain it by average satisfaction score in the establishment. And then we have some control variables. And then we also try to address this two-way causality question or challenge using quite many different techniques. But I don't actually present those technical details here, but they are described briefly in these slides, but they are, of course, explained in detail in the paper. So we use the average job satisfaction scores over the 3-year period, and that is the explanatory variables in those models. And then there are some technical issues that we try to address. For example, we try to eliminate the time invariant and establishment effects in these additional robustness checks, because that is potentially important issue here. So what we also do is that we try to estimate the effect or causal effect of job satisfaction on productivity. And for this end, we try to use information on housing conditions in the sense that we use the information on satisfaction with persons' housing conditions as an instrument for job satisfaction. And this is basically based on the very old paper by from the 60s, and well-known hypothesis in psychology that contains this spillover hypothesis that there's strong correlation between different domains of satisfaction, and we try to use that information in order to estimate the causal effects of job satisfaction or performance at the plant or firm level. And then we have some other technical issues here that we try to also address using some other methods. So what we find is this paper or in our analysis that there is positive relationship between average level of job satisfaction in the plant and the value added per hours work in the manufacturing sector. So there is evidence that there is this link between job satisfaction and productivity using this very strict definition of productivity, value added per hours work. But when we use actually this other measure, this total factor productivity, we do not, for some reason or other, find this effect. And when we use this much cruder measure of productivity, this turnover per employee as a performance measure at the productivity of firm level, we actually do not find any effect, or the effect is much weaker. So then we do this analysis that tries to use the information on housing condition or satisfaction with housing conditions, and we find that there is a strong effect in the manufacturing sector compared to this baseline results. So what we find that there is, according to this IV estimation, 1 point increase on a scale from 1 to 6 in the average level of job satisfaction in the plant increases labor productivity some 20% in the manufacturing sector. So taken as a face value, this is quite large effect, of course, but one important issue is is related to this graph that I show, this figure that shows that the distribution of job satisfaction at the plant level is like this. So in most of the plants, the average level of job satisfaction is very high. This implies basically that it's very challenging for firms or plants to increase the average job satisfaction score by 1 point on a scale from 1 to 6. So even though at the face value the effect is quite large, I would say that it is still very challenging for firms or plants to increase productivity by increasing the average job satisfaction level in the firm or plant. So what you contribute with this analysis using the linked data is that we use the standard measures of productivity or performance at the plant or firm level, and we also use nationally representative data. And these are both issues that had not been, I think, addressed very much in the literature. But of course, since we have published our paper, there have been quite many other studies using these type of measures, also using, for example, UK data. For example, Alex Bryson have done research using this type of data for the UK. So what we find is that there is this positive link between job satisfaction and productivity. But I would argue that the effect is quite modest in the sense that it is really challenging for a firm or plant to increase the average job satisfaction level by 1 point. And why this is? The simple answer is that most workers are already highly satisfied with their work as shown here. So in a sense that there is this positive link, but I would say that it is still very challenging for firms to increase performance by investing on the well-being of workers at the plant or firm level. So that was my presentation and the key takeaway from the analysis. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Böckerman. Before we open the floor with Andrew also, I just want to ask you, you're talking about the average effect here, but can you see anything if you're lifting those who are the least satisfied at work? Is that giving a stronger push on productivity?
That is, of course, very good question. But I would say that our data set is not large enough in order to analyze that. And there are very few plants in our data that have, on average, very low job satisfaction. As I saw, the distribution is such that it's very difficult to find any plant or firm in which the average level of job satisfaction of workers is about 2 or 3, because the average is almost 5 on a scale from 1 to 6. But that is very, I would say, very interesting question. But I think that our data is too small in order to analyze that issue. But of course, the UK is much larger economy, so I think that it would be easier to do that type of analyzing using the UK data. But Andrew, of course, can say more about that. But that would be very policy relevant issue, because I think that there's more. I mean, the issue is how to increase the average job satisfaction level in those firms or plants in which their average is very poor.
Okay, thanks. But the second question, you are working as a researcher at a Labour Institute, but how much do you discuss these questions on job satisfaction and productivity and other measures of success, or what do you call it? Good working firms?
I have to say that I don't know much about those discussions, because I basically work at the university. Okay. I only have a very small part-time work nowadays. But of course, the working conditions and well-being are always raised in the discussions, for example, regarding collective agreements. But I think it is very difficult to make any binding contracts or improvements at the aggregate level, because of course workers' associations always talk about the well-being and productivity and things like that, but those issues are basically already resolved at the firm or plant level. I think that they are discussed, but I don't know how seriously those discussions are taken because I mean, the employees association, basically, they don't want to hear about this issue much, I think. They always say that we can do what we want at the plant or firm level. We can discuss there, but some other type of discussions are just politics. They don't want, they are not so keen to interest in that type of results at the, that type of discussion at the aggregate or collective level.
Thank you. And Mr. Oswald, do you have any clarifying information about the Bryson study on productivity?
Not offhand. I wasn't expecting you to ask me. So I'm afraid I don't remember. I'm terribly sorry.
Okay. But then I go back to you, Andrew, and the boss issue, the topic of the topics. What do research say when you talk about competence? What does it mean? When is a boss competent to be a good boss?
Yeah, well, that's a big topic. There's an avenue of modern research called research into expert leadership, which looks at how technically competent the boss is, or in other words, could somebody who was never a good soccer player, football player, be in charge of a top team? Could somebody who's never been a banker be in charge of a giant bank? In the early part of the financial crisis, a man called Hornby was in charge of one of the biggest banks in Great Britain, and that bank went bust and had to be bailed out by the taxpayer. Now, Hornby had come from a grocery chain, and that's the kind of thing that worries those who work on so-called expert leadership. If we look at Silicon Valley, the people who run those companies, of course, were typically technical experts. So that's one way to define competence. And in work that I've been involved in, one question that shows up strongly is, could your boss do your job if necessary? And that comes in strongly positive in my job satisfaction. In other words, I have a boss who really knows what she or he is talking about. That's another way to think about it. We also know from our work that people who work their way up right through the company, decade after decade, seems to, when they become leaders, their workers are happier and they produce better financial performance and so on. So that's what I mean partly by competence. Of course, the key thing, it seems to me, is that the workers believe in the leader and believe in the competence of the leader. I'm a big Tottenham Hotspur fan, if that name of a football team means anything to you. On Thursday, I was at the stadium and we beat Arsenal, our key rivals. And our manager at the moment was a superb Italian football player. And I'm sure that when you have somebody in charge who the members of the team can look up to, whether it's a football team or anything, of course, that makes a difference.
Okay, thanks. Here's a question from the audience to the both of you, I guess. Is there studies on correlations between job satisfaction and sick leave statistics?
Well, the short answer is yes. There's quite a bit on that. Petri probably might be better qualified.
Well, I don't know. There is basically huge literature on that issue, I think, in work psychology and related fields. Not so much perhaps in economics, but I think that there are several meta-analyses on that issue. I mean, the correlation between job satisfaction and sick leaves is basically quite strong. But most of that research, actually, I don't know any research that would look at the causal effects. I mean, those are basically correlations at the individual level, but they are very strongly correlated. And I think that it's quite easy to find from the Google Scholar some meta-analysis by typing meta-analysis, sickness leaves and job satisfaction. But I think that it's very difficult to say about whether there is any causal effect or not. And it would be very challenging to analyze that. But the correlation is very strong, that I can.
Yes, the correlation is very strong. And perhaps the people watching and listening will be aware that Petri here, quite rightly as a researcher, is emphasizing what counts as completely convincing causal evidence. And I think that it's sensible to take strong correlations seriously. If you know about the old literature on smoking and lung cancer, all the early evidence was correlational. But of course, it turned out to be completely correct.
Yeah. Okay. I would like you to discuss or briefly say something about, as you said, Mr. Oswald, in economics, we talk about money as the measure of things, and you talk about relative income. But if we compare, if we want to understand how the labor market works, how important is it to understand job satisfaction in comparison to the absolute level of your wage? What is driven your movements and decisions on the labor market?
I think it's very important. If you stand back and think broadly about humans, I would say only feelings matter. Only feelings matter. It doesn't matter what the objective truth is. I know people who earn 1 million euros a year who are not very pleased with that pay packet. They look at their colleagues in the financial markets in the centre of London and they think, well, my colleague earned 2 million a year and so on. Feelings are absolutely central to human life. That's why I began in that way. And I think that we need to bring that more into the center of economics. Money does matter, but ultimately it's feelings that's the gauge of human life.
What do you say, Petri?
Yeah, I think that there's, of course, Andrew Oswald have made a huge many papers on the importance of relative income. I think that's the more wealthier the people are, perhaps they look at more at the relative position also, because I think these issues that we discuss are related to developing countries. I mean, in developing countries, I think that the issues could be quite different in the sense that the absolute level could matter more for the satisfaction.
Thanks. And here's a question from one of the viewers. I have a question for Oswald. Could you reflect upon to measure job satisfaction with a single question? Can you really know what they are satisfied with? And do colleagues have an effect on job satisfaction?
If I've understood this question, it's a good question, then I think it's fine to use what you might call an overall job satisfaction measure. Now, there's been lots of work, and I've done a little, on how satisfied are you with your pay, how satisfied are you with your colleagues, and so on. But these things are correlated, and although the first time I looked at a happiness equation or job satisfaction equation was probably 1992, I was working at the London School of Economics. I thought it was quite ridiculous to look at numbers on happiness and think that people could report something useful. I soon changed my mind. And after many decades of doing that, I've come to believe, you don't have to agree with me, but I've come to believe that it doesn't really matter how you ask a question. What people do is they look inside themselves. They ask themselves, how do I feel about life or my job? And they give an answer. And exactly how you word it, work stress, job satisfaction, happiness in the workplace, won't make much difference.
What Mr. Böckerman on that?
Yeah, I basically agree. Yeah, those are important. I basically don't have much to add to this. Yeah.
Okay. Let me talk about Richard Layard. He's a former colleague of you, Andrew, isn't it? At London School of Economics. And he's one of the, what you call, modern founders of happiness and economics. And he has this curve where we are getting richer and we are not getting happier. And we can see the same when it comes to job satisfaction. We are getting high real wages, but no increases in job satisfaction. What do we say about that? Why is it the case at all? We are going back to the money issue maybe, but...
No, well, this is an important thing, and all prime ministers and presidents need to know about this. Originally, I think the result that you're referring to comes from Richard Easterlin, who's still working in California. And it's called the Easterlin paradox in terms of GDP, gross domestic product, and happiness. And Easterlin showed that for some decades in America, the US had got much, much richer, many more BMWs and beef burgers, and hadn't got happier. Now, when it comes to job satisfaction, I think that the relative income issue becomes important. As I said, people look over their shoulders, even if they're not aware that they're doing it, and they compare to others. And if I've gone from 65,000 euros per year to 130,000 euros per year, then you might expect me to be much happier. The difficulty being a human being is that if all the other people around me have also gone up, I don't feel nearly as happy. It's relative things that matter, and therefore economic progress is like a tidal wave that lifts all the boats together. And the problem then is that what I'd like is my boat to be higher, and it doesn't work like that.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Another topic is we have discussed the productivity issue here, but can you see what happens with creativity and other form of workplace improvements when it comes to job satisfaction? Are you aware of that? Are you doing research on it? What is it to say there?
I do have something to say. Would Petri like to go first? Do you want to say anything as I spoke last time?
Well, could you please repeat, because there was a small problem with the connection.
We have so far discussed job satisfaction and the effects of productivity, but what about other dimensions, outcome variables like creativity and innovation and other kind of firm characteristics?
Yeah, that is basically very, interesting question. I haven't personally done any research on those outcomes. I think that there most likely is research on those issues in work psychology, but I'm not aware of any studies in economics regarding those outcomes. Because depending how you, basically you can use some measures of innovation, but they're, I think, quite difficult measures in a way that they're basically, you can basically measure the number of patents, for example, in the firms as a measure of innovation, but those are very, very long-term measures. And I think that it could be quite challenging to relate those type of measures of creativity to job satisfaction. But I think that there must be some research in work psychology, but I'm not aware of any research in economics on those stuff.
There is some research really of a highly innovative kind working on innovation. A woman called Alice Eisen, who died a few years ago, but was a very distinguished scholar at Cornell University. And she ran small lab experiments where she tested whether when you made people happier in the laboratory, did they become more creative? And she found that they did. I won't tell you the details. There's also a fascinating study on great artists. You might think that occasionally it's said that artists need misery to create great art. Great art doesn't come out of happiness. Well, a researcher called Katie Grady, showed that that's quite wrong, and that happiness generates the great art. And what she did was really a very clever test. She collected the price data from art auctions on the different paintings by great artists. Then she linked the prices in auction, in other words, the value of different paintings, to the different periods in the artists' lives. And she looked at the unhappy periods. Their child had died. That was common in older artists. They'd got, their wife had died, they got divorced. And she showed, I think, in a fascinating study, that the happy periods in the great artists' lives produced their best art. So I take that as evidence. I would be very pleased to have my name on that paper, but it's not on that paper. I think there is evidence that happiness generates creativity.
Oh, that's nice. Very good. I have two kind of areas where I want to discuss with you some more. And the first is the work from home research after the pandemic and everything. You know Nick Bloom in the US. Do you have any take on job satisfaction and the new work from home research and the new normal? Please, Petri, you can start.
Yeah, that is of course very relevant question. I personally haven't done any research on that topic, but I think that the working from home seems to, suit for some people. So there's a huge variation, I think, in the performance while you are working at home. There are some people who find it very useful and they are very high performance at the working at the home. But for some people, it is not working well. And there could be some psychological problems also because, there's this, people who are employed are more happier than unemployed people. And one issue is that there are still social connections at the workplace. And I think that they are quite important for some people. And of course, there are also some type of personality issues, that there are some personality traits that are more suitable for working at home than other types. So I think that it's very difficult. I don't know what to say about the average effect, but I think that it is very heterogeneous. The effects, in the sense that for some people the effect could be positive on productivity, but for other people it could be quite negative. This is actually also seen when there have been at the universities, because of course all the lectures has been at the using remote access and things like that. For some students that type of studying is working well, but there's a large group of students that suffer. They are not very well doing their work using that type of remote access, and they would need some contact teaching at the university. So I think that it's very difficult to say what is the average effect, but what I quite sure is that there are very different type of effects for different type of workers.
Okay, thanks.
My own view is that, well, scientifically, we don't know yet, because we've only got data. We've only experienced this for about 2.5 years, I suppose. And a lot of that was in a very difficult period where people were becoming ill through COVID. So statistically, in my opinion, we won't know how to answer this properly for quite a few years yet, because we'll need to look back on the era. But I have a strong view that we'll find that working from home is very positive, or the ability to do that. And there are two reasons. One is, although I didn't talk about this, is that commuting time shows up very negatively in happiness kinds of equations, the length of commute. People really are miserable commuting on average if you look at time use surveys. And second, as I did say, of course, humans like independence. They like autonomy, and they're going to get more of that if they can work somewhat at home. Therefore, I expect a few years from now, when we get proper data, we can look back, we will end up showing that this working from home revolution has helped on average. Although, as Petri said, some people, especially the young, want the social connections of the workplace.
Okay, thanks. But I think Nick Bloom presented a paper just a week ago where they said there was a negative effect of creativity, but a positive effect of job satisfaction. So can it be that it goes in different directions?
Yes, it could be. I don't know that paper, even though I know Nick. So I haven't seen that work. It accords with my intuition on job satisfaction anyway, so that's good. I don't know about creativity, but I'll be interested to see his paper.
Okay, thanks. And then from a policy perspective, I mean, the job satisfaction issue is related to the individual, to the boss, to the workplace, to the company, and to the social partners, and to the public domain. So how to address the issue of improving job satisfaction? Are there any discussions in your countries? I was a little bit about it with Petri, but is it any discussion on how to improve it, and where, at what level? Because I think that we should take steps forward in this, but I haven't seen many ideas on how to do it on a general level.
Well, there's a lot of discussion in the United Kingdom about all of this, partly related to the new working time, work from home ideas and so on. There's been a long-standing interest in job stress at work, and there's been a growth of very unhappy people in Western society, even if the average had stayed the same. So I am concerned about that for a slice of the population who don't have my kind of luck to have been born into my kind of family with my educational qualifications and so on. I am concerned about, and that will continue. There's something called the What Works Centre in the UK, which is doing research into well-being at work and related issues. I think this will be very important. Looking forward to the future, work is central to our lives, and we still don't understand the influence of electronics on people. There are many individuals who feel stressed by the fact they can always be contacted by their boss. We're going to have to learn how to deal with all of this in Western society. But I think that the key will be to work out how different parts of the labour force are differently affected. I'm pretty insulated, but a young person with low qualifications might be suffering much more than the average.
Thanks. And you, Petri, what do you say? Is it possible to approach this question? You hesitated a bit in the beginning.
Yeah, I think that is very difficult. Regarding the Finnish discussion, I mean, the workers' associations are always raising this issue about the worker well-being and related issues. But I mean, the employers' association, they are basically at the collective level, they are basically not interested about this issue at all. They always say that you have to deal with these issues in firms and plants. These are not the issues relevant for the collective labor market agreements and things like that. So in a sense that the discussion is, I think, quite asymmetric, in a sense that workers are very keen to raise these issues, but at least employers' associations are not. But at the firm level, of course, things are quite different. At the firm level, of course, if they are good firms, they always try to invest their workers' well-being and happiness. But I think that, yeah, in a sense, I think it's quite difficult discussion because there's basically workers' associations are always raising these issues, but there's basically no audience for this type of discussions, at least in Finland.
What does your Minister of Labour say? Does he or she have any opinion on it?
Well, I don't know. Basically, during the last 2 years, there have been so other issues on their mind. I think that, of course, there are political policy papers in which they always say that this is an important issue. But there's a huge gap, I think, with the that type of policy reports and reality, because they always say that this is important issues, but they basically do not do anything at the higher level. They always say that this belongs to the firms and plans to do these improvements in working conditions and well-being. So in a sense that it's very, I mean, yeah. And then it's very difficult to say what happens in firms, yeah, I think.
Could I say one other thing?
Sure.
I'm conscious that there are three men on this screen, at least on my screen. And it does seem important to make the point that there's liable to be more and more discussion about how females are remunerated compared to males in the labour market, and who gets promoted, who becomes a CEO, and so on. I expect in the rest of my lifetime to see a great deal on that, and that shouldn't be forgotten in policy discussions, even though there are three men on this screen.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, you are absolutely correct about that. Before I finish up, is there anything you think that we should bring up before we close? The most important issues not discussed so far?
I have one thing that we haven't discussed, and I do believe is important and is likely to come much more to the foreground. Yeah. And that is, should everybody's pay be public knowledge? Yeah. Should pay be secret, as it were, confidential, or should everybody know what all workers earn? That's a very difficult issue, and it touches a little bit on women being underpaid relative to men, by the way. If you're female, you might believe that pay transparency, let's call it that, is a good idea. I suspect that will become a major topic in public debate. And there's one study, an empirical study published in something called the American Economic Review, which made an impression on me. At the University of California, Berkeley, a talented research team decided to send an email to half of the employees at Berkeley, reminding them that if they want, because it's a public university, they can find out what everyone in their department earns by clicking on the following link. Half of the university didn't get that email, so this was a randomized experiment. And what the researchers showed was sending that email, telling people they could find out what everybody earned, produced a lot of clicking. A lot of people were clicking on that link to find this out, and those who got that email, on average, became less satisfied with their jobs. The people who discovered they were well paid, it made no difference to. The people who discovered they were less well paid compared to how they thought they were, presumably, they started to quit. So pay transparency, although in an ideal world, it sounds like a good idea. We'd have to know what we're getting into, because everybody feels that they should be paid well, and we all tend to value certain things about our contribution in the workplace.
Very good, thanks. And Petri, do you have any question we should brought up?
No, I think that one issue regarding this well-being is always that, because I'm, of course, doing high-level research using register-based data, I always just wondering what is the connection to practice at the firms or in firms. I mean, because I think that there's quite a large gap between academic research and what is actual reality in firms. I mean, it's very difficult to say how to improve well-being at the workplaces, by what are the concrete measures, what to do in firms. So I think that there's still some type of gap between academic research and reality in firms in that sense. And that is also the issue that is always raised by the Employers Association, because when we present this type of research to the seminars that there are Employers Associations, they always say nice study, but nothing to do with reality. Of course, we don't agree with that statement, but they always see that the reality in firms is this and that. There are so different firms, and you don't know anything about what happens in firms. So I think that there's still some gap between academic research and what the bosses and workers do at the workplaces.
I suppose I'm more optimistic, Daniel, than Petri on that. I think there's lots of important empirical research which is extremely helpful in principle to actual firms and bosses. And I'd like to think my list of conclusions, I don't remember them all now, is practically useful, as well as being something generated by academic research.
I have one.
Yeah, that was a very good point. I was just wondering, I mean, the Finnish discussion, that what my point was. I mean, because the employers associations are always saying it's very difficult to participate some seminars in which they are always so. I mean, they're always so. For some reason or other, I don't know whether the situation is similar in other countries. For example, in Sweden, but at least in Finland, for some reason or other, they are always so very extremely skeptical regarding this type of reasoning.
Okay. I have a question from Helena here. She says, how to explain high job satisfaction and high turnover rates among, for example, care workers? And is there any research on if the relative effect of pay is the same among high and low income earners?
I think relative pay matters equally. Relative pay matters equally to very rich workers and rather poor workers, because wherever you are in the labor market or life, you compare to people rather like you. In the care sector, job satisfaction tends to be low relative to many other occupations, even though people in surveys feel it's worthwhile and socially useful in care. We certainly have plenty of evidence that job satisfaction is a predictor of whether you will quit your job in the next 12 months. There's evidence all over the world that it's highly predictive of that.
Do you have any extra comment on that, Petri?
Well, I think that it's very important to take into account all working conditions. I mean, there could be some other, if you just look at the correlation between two variables, there could be some other issues at the workplace. For example, there could be some adverse working conditions and job stress and things like that that do not reflect so strongly in job satisfaction. That could also explain high turnover rates. But generally, I think that the correlation is very strong with job satisfaction and turnover. There's a huge literature on that issue, as Andrew noted.
What about the future of this research? What is the status now before we close? What do you think about the future of it?
Well, the future is very bright. Only feelings matter, right? If you just think it through, only feelings matter. Yeah. And people outside economics, as a discipline, researchers have known that for a long time. And I would like to think that economists are becoming more human and thinking about those issues. They're certainly thinking about them a lot more than they were in 1980 when I graduated from Oxford with a PhD in economics, and I was told you should not study human feelings.
Yes. Petri, any final word from you on the future of this research?
Well, I think that we have just taken first steps in this type of research, at least in economics, because this is quite new field in economics still. And I think that there's plenty of opportunities to broaden our understanding of human well-being in many ways.
Okay, then I think we're ready to close, and we are very happy to have you with us today. There's very much information for the viewers, and hopefully we, with our small project here, will maybe get back to you in a year or two to have a further discussion then. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.